It's where the coronavirus started, but also where things are now returning to normal. So what is China's post-coronavirus strategy? The National People's Congress is dealing with both criticism over its handling of the pandemic and concerns over its economy. So how will China move forward? This is Inside Story. Hello, I'm Kamal Santamaria. It is normally a time to outline the strength of China and the Communist Party. But then what's normal about these times? Already, the annual session of the National People's Congress had to be postponed from its usual slot in March. But it's happening now amid a pandemic that's altered China's agendas and shuffled its priorities. The country is facing the challenge of restoring an economy that's shrunk almost 7% in just the first quarter of this year. In fact, Beijing's been forced to abandon setting an economic growth target for the first time in decades. Now it has other priorities, stabilising employment, living standards as well. The announcement was made by Premier Li Keqiang at the start of the parliamentary meeting. And while China's faced widespread criticism for its handling of the crisis, Li was praising its response.
Under the strong leadership of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, with Comrade Xi Jinping at its core, and through the hard work and sacrifice of our entire nation, we have made major strategic achievements in our response to COVID-19. At present, the epidemic has not yet come to an end. While the tasks we face in promoting development are immense, we must strive to minimise the losses resulting from the virus and work hard to fulfil the targets and tasks for economic and social development this year.
So, as Premier Li said, coronavirus is not over. It also can't be ignored that the outbreak did start in China, in Wuhan, late last year. Many countries, chief among them the United States, accused China of covering up the crisis during its early days. Whistleblowers were allegedly silenced, and many doubted the official numbers of infections and deaths coming out of China. The US went as far as to suggest the virus came from a lab in Wuhan. And along with other countries, it's called for an investigation into the origins. In response, the World Health Organization has agreed to set up an inquiry after coming under pressure from the US for praising China's response. Through it all, though, China says it has been transparent. It has sent medical aid to many countries and it is working towards a vaccine. So where to from here? Well, our panel is going to help us answer that in Beijing. We've got Dan Wang, an economist and analyst at the Economist Intelligence Unit's Access China Service. In New Jersey, Gordon Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China, which is quite a book title, and The Great US-China Tech Way. And back in Beijing, rounding out our panel is Aina Tangen, a China political affairs analyst and former provincial government advisor. To welcome to all three of you. I think the first point just to make from the start about the Congress is that it is, regardless of when it happens, it is largely ceremonial. It is in some ways predictable. And Dan, if I can come to you first, we can't underplay the fact that the people will listen, won't they? They will trust what their leaders are saying and that it is the right plan for them going forward.
Well, in China, there is no doubt that the state has a very strong capacity and also authority. And it's not just in China. In most of Asian countries, people look up to authorities naturally, and that have led to a relatively ease in implementing the containing measures for the coronavirus. And China is relatively successful in containing the spread of the coronavirus. It has a lot to do with the strong state capacity and also with a very strong public trust. We have heard a lot of complaints about how China has handled its measures in fighting this virus. But if you go down the street talking to individuals, talking to private businesses, you actually find that there is still very strong public trust on that the Chinese government can have this epidemic under control.
Gordon, do you agree with that there is that sort of trust, or is this maybe, given what has happened with coronavirus, maybe just a slight opportunity for people to question it and say, well, what did happen here?
Well, I'm sure that in various cities there are various responses. So, for instance, in Wuhan, there probably is less trust. And we have seen examples of that. So, for instance, when a minister toured the city after the outbreak, she was met with howls of derision from people. And of course, after Dr. Li Wenlong died on February 7th, there was white-hot anger on social media across China. And China went to extraordinary efforts to censor social media posts. It's a real question. Clearly, the government and the Communist Party have the ability to influence narratives. And that has really been the primary effort of the party, especially we saw with the composition of the January 26th leading small group of the Communist Party on the coronavirus. They only had one public health official on a 9-person roster. The rest of it was security types, political hacks, and, of course, propaganda officials. So, yeah, they're doing a good job, but that's because that's their highest priority.
Ina Tangen, your early thoughts on this. Was it a different sort of Congress that's going on this year? I mean, even just by some of the measurements, the speech which Premier Li gave was shorter. It was focused in a different direction.
Well, I think the major takeaways here are that Li was laying out what the groundwork was for going forward. I mean, obviously, this is for China now about the economic battle, although the international battle, of course, it goes on, but it's not something they can control. If Donald Trump or Europe or whoever, Brazil, wants to open up early and doesn't want to take the necessary precautions, that's going to delay the resolution of this until there is actually some sort of antiviral that can be administered. And remember, it's not just developing, it's getting 8 million of these things out to people and making sure that they can get them. Otherwise, you don't conquer it, and it just kind of stays with us ad infinitum. So at this point, Li was making his case that China has done actually a pretty good job. And it wasn't about all sorts of self-congratulatory stuff. Unlike Donald Trump, he said, both he and she said that there are big issues that need to be addressed. They talked about things that need to be improved. And I think that's a very sober and very refreshing response, given the kind of hyperbole and nonsense that we're hearing from other parties around the world.
OK, we're going to come back to that later on. But importantly, Ina has brought up the economic issue. And I think, Dan, you're best placed to start us off on this. The fact that China in this Congress did not set an economic target, I think that's quite significant. And when you think about the fact that the economy has contracted 7% in one quarter and that the IMF is predicting only 1.2% growth for 2020, these are unheard of numbers for China.
Right. We're very surprised, too, that there was no GDP target during the meeting, because everybody was expecting it. And you can see the disappointment in the market. Right after this meeting, we saw stock market tumbled immediately. But I do think this is the right thing to do for the Chinese government. Right now, its focus is not so much on boosting growth, but rather on containing risks. So there has been a lot of risks accumulating in the past decade. It's about debt, the financial market, the banking system, accumulating debt on the local government level and also in the corporate sector. So in this year and also in 2021, I don't think the fiscal stimulus or the monetary easing would be nearly as significant as those Western countries. So if we compare now the fiscal stimulus with what America is doing, China is only have about 5% of GDP equivalent of fiscal stimulus package, in contrast to about 14 to 20% of a fiscal stimulus package in the US. And this is quite unusual for the Chinese government. They're being very cautious.
OK, so Dan has pointed out there some of the different priorities now away from the economy. And I do just want to go through that very quickly. Li's strategy, it went under the banner of 6 protections. And I just want to go through them really quickly here. You've got job security, you've got people's livelihoods, you've got businesses. So those ones are basically all the things related to how well people are looked after and indeed how well they can look after themselves. And then there are 3 others, and these are sort of more deeper issues, I would say. You've got food and energy security, stable industrial and supply chains, and even how the lower levels of the Chinese government functions. Remembering, you've got actually a 5-level hierarchy in the Chinese leadership. So 6 layers there. And Dan, again, I'll just get a quick word from you before we move on to the others. What's the biggest thing out of those 6? Is it about job security for people, about their livelihoods, about quality of life? What's the one of those which you take out?
I think it's about job security,
Okay.
because this would be the difficult year for Chinese government to generate enough jobs for university graduates, for migrants, and especially for those urban workers that actually have a mortgage. And it would be the first year that many Chinese people would see for the first time a shrink in their household wealth and individual income. And this is a very serious issue for the Chinese government.
Okay, then, Gordon, let me bring you back in there. So we'll continue talking about job security and employment. Officially, I believe 6% is the unemployment rate, but I also understand that there are 300 million migrant workers in China who aren't included necessarily in those numbers. So again, can you trust the numbers out of China, and how big an issue do you think employment is right now in China?
Well, I agree that when you look at the work report, Premier Li Keqiang, instead of targeting GDP growth, what he was doing was he was shifting the targets to employment. So he had the 6% unemployment rate. He had the target of 9 million new jobs. But to put the 9 million new urban jobs into context, we got to remember that last year, officially, they created 13.52 million new urban jobs. So this is really quite stunning. Right now, we can't trust the numbers, especially the employment numbers have historically been underreported because they used to report 4% each year for decades. So the employment numbers don't really make any sense. We can maybe discern trends, but that's about it when it comes to employment. But clearly, this is the most important thing for the Communist Party right now, because that's an issue of stability, and stability is an issue of continued Communist Party rule.
Just remind me, sorry, what was that number you said about numbers that had been created? Jobs that had been created?
Oh, last year, officially, urban employment, new jobs was 13.52 million new jobs. That's in contrast to the 9 million target for the current year.
Okay, so let me throw that over to Ina then. Can you extrapolate those numbers for us a bit more? And as Gordon says as well, the issues which people outside of China might have with interpreting those numbers.
Well, that's part of the problem with this argument. Everyone keeps talking about China's untrustworthy. I mean, most governments put out numbers. There are always questions. The question is, can you get at more basic data? I don't think anybody has any doubt that there was a lot of jobs produced last year. There's an anti-poverty drive, things. But, let's go back to this GDP. I think we're missing something here. The fact is, GDP has been going up for years, all right? But for the average person, their salaries, their real incomes have been sliding sideways. So what does real GDP mean to the average person? Apart from the fact as a metric, it's flawed because it double counts so many things, especially with this global supply chain. So what China has done is they've switched to metrics that can be much more easily measured. If you say 9 million jobs, that's 9 million jobs. If you say you're going to increase disposable income, that means something. If you're going to provide aid to small businesses and you're trying to create more businesses, if you hit those marks, then you've done something and people can see it and they can feel it. I think that it's a disservice worldwide to continue using GDP. I've said this has nothing to do with China not choosing to report this year, just simply it doesn't make any sense. And I think Dan would agree with me. It's a nice overall measure, but it doesn't really tell you how the average person is doing.
No, it's a fair point, actually, and it's much in the way in the United States that Donald Trump will talk about the strength of the stock market, where that really doesn't affect, the general population. Dan, Ina said he thinks you'll agree with him.
Well, I was going to add that actually in terms of the quality of China's job market number, I don't think the official number is that far off. Of course, we have our own estimate of this year's unemployment rate. We think it's going to hit 10% for the full year. And in the second quarter, it'll probably hit at least 18% if we account all the migrant workers that might lose their job. But there are two different kinds of official figures for unemployment rate. One is the urban surveyed unemployment rate, and that is the target for 6% this year, as Gordon has pointed out. And historically, the 4%, that was the registered unemployment rate, and that was absolutely not accurate at all, and nobody looked at that. But in the past few years, what we have been hearing is actually more of a story of a labor shortage rather than unemployment. Because with 6 to 10% or even faster economic growth, it was a bigger problem to find enough workers to work for the factory rather than a surplus of workers. There were unemployment, but a lot of those unemployment were seasonal and they were not permanent.
Right, you've all mentioned the issues of manufacturing and factories and supply chain, so I want to go on to that, and Ina, I'll start with you. There is, and it's anecdotal, but there is talk out there from other countries who are now realising just how tied into China they are as far as global supply chains, and they're thinking, well, if this sort of thing's going to happen, we need to think about making our own goods. We need to think about bringing things home. How much of a problem is that potentially for China?
Well, I mean, there's the idea and then there's the reality. The fact is, once you start trying to pull things home, if you cannot produce them efficiently, in essence, what you've done is passed on a higher cost to your citizens, your consumers. So that's not always very popular. People will get very tired of paying more for what they used to get, just simply because, quote, it's made in this country. Also, it kills your exports. Obviously, if it costs more to produce something, you're not going to be able to sell it abroad unless the government subsidizes it. So it's a no-lose, no-win proposition. Countries think about it emotionally. But the one thing that we've seen over the last 30 years is that globalization has cut the price of goods. You can simply buy more. And this is one of the ways in which the middle class has been kind of duped, because they have been able to buy a lot more. They can, buy an expensive, what would have been an untouchable phone for, still a high price, but something they can afford. Whereas in the past, it would have cost much, much more. So you've seen a lot of things go down in price, food, etc., even oil right now, as we've all experienced. But, the truth is, it doesn't work economically. And if you go back to this model, you're in essence saying that the free market doesn't work. I don't know that there are a lot of people in the U.S. who want to join that bandwagon. Also, when you pull out, okay, where's your overseas market? You're basically giving up everything. Because let's say the U.S. Companies pulled out of China. That would be $350, $400 billion worth of goods not sold. That would have impact in the U.S. That would really decrease our numbers. And I'm just talking about companies, American companies who are here, who are selling here.
Gordon, why were you shaking your head there?
Well, because factories are moving from China, and they're moving for a number of reasons. But, there's a number of issues here, and one of them is supply chain robustness. China's declared a people's war on the United States. They did that last May. They took steps to deliberately spread the coronavirus beyond their borders, in all probability, from what we can tell. And so Americans are starting to understand there's something more important than just low cost. It's also reliability of supply, because China has threatened to cut off supplies to the United States of critical materials. And in fact, it's done that with regard to other countries as well. So from the United States point of view, we can have goods made in India, which would be just as cheap. And I think we're probably going to move in that direction, largely because there's a cost to buying goods in China and enriching a hostile regime. So there are going to be political barriers to trade. Goods will be more expensive, at least in the interim. But eventually, I think we're going to find that the markets will adjust and Americans will have access to low-cost goods. Plus, they'll have a more reliable supply. Plus, we will not be enriching a hostile state.
But the thing is, you're saying eventually there, and I think that's actually quite important because, so much product is made in China and exported from China, not just to the United States, but to all over the world. Unraveling that would take years, decades possibly.
Well, I think it would take less than decades. When I was practicing law in Hong Kong in 1989, I represented an American consumer products company, and they manufactured in Guangdong. They were concerned about political disruption, so they moved a factory to Thailand, and it took them a couple months. And then when they saw that the political problems in China were not affecting the supply chain, they moved their Thai factory back into Guangdong province. So this can be done quickly. And matter of fact, we've seen that as factories have left China for various reasons, including cost, going to places like Vietnam, going to places like India and the rest of it. And if you look at the trend of Chinese propaganda, it's very, very corrosive against India. And that's a real indication that Beijing is worried about factories leaving China. This is a trend. It's occurring. And I think it'll pick up speed, especially as countries understand how maligned China has been. Because you got to remember that China has now, at this very moment, is involved in threats against India. It wants to take over Kazakhstan. We've seen the incursions into Indian-controlled territory. There's all sorts of things that are occurring right now that countries are going to understand.
Okay, Gordon, pause for a second. Ina, a quick reply from you then, and then I want to go back to Dan for some other questions.
A broken record of half-truths. I mean, the situation is not that simple, and I understand he has a lot of experience from 1989, but that is not the case. If you actually go to the AmCham here, and you talk to them, and they've done surveys both in the Shanghai chapter and also in the Beijing. I think companies are moving production out of China, but they're not moving out of China. What they're doing is they're putting future production in other places. Why? Because Donald Trump has declared that China is off limits, erected a Cold War. This kind of China started it routine is nonsense. I don't think anybody in the right mind, and I understand that my worthy opponent here has read the big book, Coronavirus, put out by Donald and Associates, and says that you should attack China at every moment to re-elect Donald Trump. But I don't think it's really very rational, and I don't think anyone really believes that.
Okay, then. I'm going to leave that there. But what this discussion, particularly between Gordon and Ina, has raised is potentially an image problem. And Dan, I'd like to ask you about that. After coronavirus, after the mudslinging from the likes of Donald Trump and others, does China have an image problem that it needs? Will that be important to fix for it to move forward?
It is extremely important for China to fix its image because to me, I'm living in China, so I don't feel that as strongly as my foreign colleagues. But now in the US, actually, you don't have to be Chinese. You just have to look like Asian for people to sort of have the bias against you. And I think for China to correct that impression, it's going to be a very tough battle. Now the ideology competition and how China-US relation is evolving is quite worrying. And we have seen that there are a lot of conflicts during the two countries' competition in technology, in geopolitics. And now China has to come forward to give more transparency about the origin of this coronavirus. And right now, it's more of a mystery rather than a secret for Chinese government, in my opinion, because the internal investigation is going on. But absolutely, China has to step up and do more international collaboration with the UN, with the EU, with other countries, and try to come up with a report and a clear saying what they did on January 3rd when they made the decision of locking down Wuhan, exactly what measures were made and how they reached that decision. And after that, what happened exactly in the city and what and when do they decide to ask people to go back to work. And those are the questions that China needs to become more transparent. Otherwise, I think it'd be really hard for it to make friends in the international stage.
Just really quickly, Dan, 30 seconds, and this is a slight tangent to end on, but Hong Kong, I mean, we see already the protests starting up there again, and the issues of the national security law. That's another thing which you would need to, on an international stage, really think about.
Well, the Hong Kong issue is it's going to be very tricky. Because now we have seen that China has tightened the grip of its control over Hong Kong, and we know that as a financial center is very important. But I'm personally a bit more pessimistic over Hong Kong's future because the fundamental problems of its having its protests in the past was not solved. And we have seen a capital outflow away from Hong Kong. So it's going to be a tough battle for the Hong Kong citizens as well.
Folks, this has been a great discussion, lots of different perspectives, which is what we like on Inside Story. Dan Wang, Gordon Chang, Ina Tangen, thank you so much for your time. And thank you for watching wherever you are around the world. Remember, we are online as well in the show section at aljazeera.com, also on Facebook at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. Just at AJ Inside Story on Twitter or at Kamal AJE if you want to get in touch with me directly. I'm Kamal Santamaria from the whole Inside Story team. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you again soon.